Hello everyone. This video is about how we distinguish letters written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi from the personal letters written by his secretaries. Sometimes a personal letter written by a secretary has been accidentally tagged as "On behalf of Shoghi Effendi." I have some examples of letters wrongly tagged as "On behalf", and on the screen I have a 2019 letter on behalf of the House of Justice that would lead to big changes in this area if its criteria were to be applied to all these letters. But I think this 2019 letter is only a simplifying first step towards working out what makes a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi and what the Guardian intended that to mean for us today. Letters have been classified as on behalf of Shoghi Effendi in diverse ways. In some cases, it is simply that a National Spiritual Assembly decides to publish all the correspondence it has in the box labelled Guardian. How did the letter get in the box? Perhaps because the secretary at the time had no better place to put it, or because an archivist later decided that was where it would be safe. In other cases, the research department at the Baha'i World Centre makes a decision based on the letter's contents and information they have about its context. Generally, the selection of items is left to the National Spiritual Assembly, who delegate it to the editors of National and Regional Collection of Shoghi Effendi's letters. Collections such as High Endeavours, Messages to the Antipodes, The Unfolding Destiny of the British Baha'i Community, Messages from the Guardian compiled from Baha'i News, Messages to America, Dawn of a New Day, The Light of Divine Guidance, and more. The way it has worked until now is that the editors of such collections of Shoghi Effendi's letters decipher the letters, which are generally handwritten on folded plain paper. Editors decide whether to make minor corrections and what additional information should be included. And editors decide what is on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. Some editors are inclusive, not wanting to exclude anything that might be historically interesting. And others have, in my opinion, used incorrect criteria to exclude things that should be counted as on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. Then more writers and editors mine the collections of letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi to find something relevant to a topic, such as alcohol in society, or the role of secular youth movements, or homosexuality, or women on the House of Justice. And by and large, they trust the editors who have gone before them. And then more writers quote one another without going back to the foundation. How did the letter end up in that literal or metaphorical box? The first example I have is a letter from Suhail Afnan to Mrs. Dewing in 1925. Suhail Afnan was Shoghi Effendi's younger cousin and, as we will see below, his companion and also his secretary. He became a significant intellectual in philosophy and Iranian studies and has his own Wikipedia page. But when he wrote this, he was 21 years old. He is responding to a letter from Mrs. Amy Dewing, the mother of Bertram Dewing, who was to be one of the founding members of the National Spiritual Assembly of New Zealand. As usual, I will paraphrase and simplify, and you can read the full text as I have it on the screen by pausing the video. Suhail writes, I received your letter only a short while ago. I was away from Haifa with Shoghi Effendi. Your letter was kept until my return. I am so sorry that the answer to your mail did not reach you, as I know Shoghi Effendi did answer. In connection with the subject of prohibition, the Baha'i teachings are quite against drinking intoxicating liquors, and from the Baha'i point of view, everything that helps to stop drinking is welcomed. As to the Scout movement, they afford a great disciplinary lesson to the young boys and girls. This, of course, is my own personal view. I am so glad to know that your children are taking a more active interest in the cause, and Shoghi Effendi trusts that they will in future be able to render great services. The copies of the Herald of the South which you sent me, I was glad to look over, and Shoghi Effendi has been glad to see them. He wrote a letter for it some time ago. The family join me in loving greetings to yourself and dear children for the new year. Note that's the Gregorian year, not the Baha'i year. Yours in his service, Suhail. This tells us that Suhail didn't receive Mrs. Dewey's letter promptly because it was addressed to him personally, and he was away from Haifa. Perhaps it was not sent to him because it came with some Herald of the South magazines, and the postage would have been expensive. Apparently, in late 1925 and before, Mrs. Dewey and Suhail Afnan were writing letters to one another, and we learn that Shoghi Effendi had written his own letter in reply to Mrs. Dewey, but this went astray in the mail. Suhail sends greetings from his family. The magazine copies were sent to him and were shown to Shoghi Effendi, and he emphasizes that the bit about scouting is just his own opinion. His reference to soldiers with imperialistic designs reminds us that people in Palestine had reason to have reservations about empires, which they knew in the Ottoman, French, and British varieties. This letter is a very clear case of personal correspondence that has been inadvertently published and quoted and commented as a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. Early in 1926, Mrs. Dewey was elected to the first local spiritual assembly of Auckland. This is where the Baha'i archives were kept when the National Spiritual Assembly of New Zealand was formed. Her son, Bertram, became a member of the National Spiritual Assembly. So we can picture how this letter would have ended up in the box labelled Guardian in the New Zealand Baha'i archives. But it didn't stay in the box. The snippet about the Scout movement, up to the words, "This of course is my own personal view," was published in the selection of letters Aroha Nui in 1982. Aroha Nui means much love, and it is still a common way to end a letter or email in New Zealand. In Aroha Nui, the piece about scouting has the editorial tag, "Letter written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, December 30th, 1925. Suhail's letter was then published in full in the 1997 edition of Messages to the Antipodes, meaning the whole letter was then thought to be on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. The quote above is taken from the 1997 edition. In the 2021 edition of Messages to the Antipodes, the letter is excluded entirely. A letter from the Secretariat of the World Centre in 2019 says, "It is apparent that the 30 December 1925 letter written by Suhail Afnan is a personal letter from Suhail Afnan. The National Spiritual Assembly of Australia is being asked to remove these letters from the book when it is reprinted." But the letter by then had its own life. In Studying the Writings of Shoghi Effendi by Morton Bergsmo, 1991, page 156, the reader is asked in the study questions, what is Shoghi Effendi's personal view about the Scout movement and its teachings on war? And the reference is to page 89 of Aroha Nui. Suhail Afnan's personal view, words that Suhail inserts to remind Mrs. Dewey that he is not writing on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, has become Shoghi Effendi's personal view, based on the supposition that the letter is written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. That's a circular argument. The compiler for this section of Studying the Writings of Shoghi Effendi is Shahryar Razavi, a current member of the Universal House of Justice. Arahanui also published another section from Sohail's letter about prohibition, which he thinks is welcome. Since the whole letter is Sohail's personal correspondence, his statement that legal prohibition of the sale and consumption of alcohol is welcome from the Baha'i point of view is also just his personal opinion. I disagree. I think that state control with drinking venues controlled by community trusts is a better way to limit the harm done by alcohol. But that is just my opinion. I cannot guess what Shoghi Effendi's view would have been. But the fact is, Arahanui has labelled this as a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. What is to stop Baha'i compilation makers and commentators on health and law from presenting this as the Baha'i view? Where is the central register that would tell Baha'i authors and readers in general what the current status of each letter is? We have to draw our own conclusions based on what we know and our own criteria. A second example, counted as On Behalf in the 1997 edition, but removed in the 2021 edition of Messages to the Antipodes, is the White Australia letter from Dr. John Esselmont to Major McLeod. It's a long letter, clearly personal correspondence. Among other things, Esselmont gives his views on immigration policy in Australia, saying, "There is undoubtedly truth in the contention that if people accustomed to a lower standard of life and culture are freely admitted and allowed unrestricted rights of commercial and industrial competition, the standard of living and culture in that country is bound to suffer. The backward races must be educated. If this is done, their objectionable characteristics will disappear." In the whole letter, there is nothing to indicate that this is a letter from the Office of the Guardianship, written on behalf of the Guardian. He mentions that Major McLeod had become a Baha'i and has written separately to Shoghi Effendi, just as Mrs. Dewing did, and he reports that Shoghi Effendi was very pleased. But when Abdu'l-Baha was alive, Esselmont and other English-speaking Baha'is were regularly reporting about the doings and opinions of Abdu'l-Baha, and nobody treats these as letters on behalf of Abdu'l-Baha. The words Shoghi Effendi considers, or Shoghi Effendi was pleased, are reports. They do not in themselves prove that the letter is written in the secretarial role on behalf of the Guardian. The odd thing about this letter, in addition to its initial inclusion as a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, is the reason for its exclusion from the new edition of Antipodes. It is because the original or a copy of the 19 April 1925 letter is not held at the Baha'i World Centre, and therefore it cannot be authenticated, according to the Secretariat at the Baha'i World Centre. That is common sense. The original of the letter would have been posted to Major McLeod, and in the unlikely event that Dr. Esselmont kept his own copy, it would be in his personal papers, not in the archives at the Baha'i World Centre. The reason this letter should be excluded is that it is a personal letter. Its absence from the archives follows from it being a personal letter. That suggests a rule for identifying letters written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. If the Baha'i World Centre does have the file copy of the outgoing letter, that is a very strong reason for saying that the letter must have been written on behalf of the Guardian. It would be nice if it were possible to say only letters for which the original file copy is in the archives are to be considered letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi. But that would throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the secretaries whose letters give us difficulties may also be secretaries who were not very good at filing copies of incoming and outgoing correspondence. Sometimes a letter apparently is on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, but the only copy available is the one sent to the addressee. David Hoffman refers to this problem in his biography of George Townsend, blaming the very poor secretarial service which the Guardian received from his cousins and brother. Relatives had far too often written his letters, not as though on his behalf, but as if they themselves were the correspondents. Neither were they careful of the incoming letters, and many are missing, knowledge of them deriving from their acknowledgement. Hoffman notes one instance in which a secretary takes it upon himself to give George Townsend a word of personal advice in a letter supposedly written on behalf of the Guardian. That's in David Hoffman's George Townsend, Hand of the Cause of God, page 102. Of course, an alternative explanation is that the letters which David Hoffman is referring to were not written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, and that's why there are no copies. David Hoffman is inclined to tag letters not as on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, but rather as coming from the secretary. He describes a letter as his secretary's letter in many places, or he says a full explanation from the secretary, and so forth. There are plenty of exceptions where a letter is tagged as on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, but I do not see a clear criterion that David Hoffman is using, perhaps because I do not know the names of the secretaries, whereas Hoffman did know, and he would be likely to know which secretaries were inclined to take things on themselves and which were not. In 3 cases, Hoffman describes letters as written in part by the secretary. I have observed what I think are mixed letters too. Typically, the first 2 paragraphs convey a message from Shoghi Effendi, and the secretary continues with his own thoughts. Ruhi Afnan's approach to the role of the secretary can be shown by an example from 1933. On March 29, Ruhi Afnan wrote to Eric Watkin, referring to Watkin's thesis on the Baha'i teachings and education. The letter says that Shoghi Effendi has not yet read the thesis, and follows with detailed corrections to it. Logically, these corrections must be primarily from Ruhi Afnan. But he also says at one point, I have mentioned this to the Guardian, and he also feels you had better leave out the passage. So the author of the letter is Ruhi Afnan, but he has on some points consulted with Shoghi Effendi. There is another letter from Esselmont to Mr. and Mrs. Hyde Dunn that begins, Shoghi Effendi has asked me to reply, and I also owe you a letter on my own account. He is explicitly writing both on behalf of Shoghi Effendi and as the correspondent himself, and he fills the letter with entirely personal matters, but then drops in something from Shoghi Effendi, not in the first paragraphs, but in the middle of the letter. Shoghi Effendi entirely approves of your suggestion regarding an international song of love, and hopes you will be confirmed in having it perfected and set to suitable music. There is one phrase in the suggested text that I think had better be altered or omitted. The 2019 letter from the Secretariat on behalf of the Universal House of Justice proposes that letters in which the Secretary does not say that he or she is writing on behalf of the Guardian should be considered as personal correspondence, unless the House of Justice decides otherwise. They write, in rare instances, a personal letter written by a secretary has been inadvertently included in a published volume. Such a letter is not difficult to identify, as it does not indicate that it was written on Shoghi Effendi's behalf. I think this rule, requiring an explicit statement from the writer that the letter is being written on behalf, risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Take this example. The number 9, which in itself is the number of perfection, is considered by the Baha'is as sacred because it is symbolic of the perfection of the Baha'i revelation, which constitutes the 9th in the line of existing religions. The 8th is the religion of the Bab, and the remaining 7 are Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the religion of the Sabaeans. As regards your question concerning the membership of the Universal House of Justice, there is a tablet from Abdu'l-Baha in which he definitely states that the membership of the Universal House is confined to men, and that the wisdom of it will be fully revealed in the future. In the local, as well as the national houses of justice, however, women have the full right of membership. It is therefore only to the international house that they cannot be elected. The Baha'is should accept the statement of the Master in a spirit of deep faith, confident that there is a divine guidance and wisdom behind it, which will be gradually unfolded to the eyes of the world. The published extract of the letter does not indicate it was being written on the Guardian's behalf. By the rule of 2019, it should be treated as personal correspondence from the Secretary, which it may be, but another part of the letter, or something else about its context, or a later quotation from the letter, might show that it was not just an opinion, but a letter on behalf of the Guardian. In 1994, I asked the research department about various anomalies in the letters categorized as On Behalf of Shoghi Effendi, and I mentioned a statement made by Philip Hainsworth in his 1979 introduction to Unfolding Destiny, which is a selection of messages to the Baha'i community of the British Isles. Mr. Hainsworth wrote, prior to April 1941, the Guardian had few helpers, and his secretaries had caused him much suffering. Only their letters which carried the Guardian's handwriting as a footnote, or contained words which indicated they were writing as instructed by him, have been used. I do not think that words such as Shoghi Effendi considers, or Shoghi Effendi was pleased, are a sufficient criterion, because pilgrims and the secretaries in their private correspondence make such reports. Shoghi Effendi was the most interesting local topic they could share with their correspondents. I also do not regard a postscript as evidence that the writer is writing on behalf, because there are personal letters that have postscripts from Shoghi Effendi. Another letter by Esselmont can serve as an example. He writes, I have quite recovered from my pleurisy now, and am steadily regaining my strength. Shoghi Effendi is still tired. I hope he will soon be able to take a rest. Was that written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi? Is it a message from the office of the guardianship? Obviously not. Shoghi Effendi is the subject of a report here, not the author even in an indirect way. But this letter has a postscript from Shoghi Effendi, which says, I am so glad to hear from you directly and learn of your improved health and meeting with the English Baha'is. I need not assure you of my ardent prayers for your happiness, good health, and continued success in the service of the cause. And so on. He signs himself Shoghi. Why would a personal letter have a postscript from the Guardian? Abdu'l-Baha's practice was to read all outgoing mail from anyone at the Baha'i World Centre. Did Shoghi Effendi abandon this? If so, when? It would obviously be desirable for him to read everything going out, because one person's innocent or not so innocent comment to a friend could end up causing problems in a Baha'i community somewhere, or causing problems for the Baha'is somewhere. Shoghi Effendi had to be his own director of communications, making sure that everything stayed on message. But was he able to keep reading everything written by everybody at the World Centre? I don't know. But if Shoghi Effendi puts his postscript on Dr. Esselmont's personal letter, he must at that time have been reading outgoing letters. And it makes sense that he might add his own short message to an outgoing letter to save time and postage costs. But in my view, the letter is still no more than the personal correspondence with the news and opinions of the writer. My general reconstruction of the way these letters were produced is that Baha'i individuals and institutions were writing to Shoghi Effendi and to staff at the Baha'i World Centre, and would sometimes put two letters in one envelope. Shoghi Effendi would answer a letter himself, or decide to have it answered by a secretary. And what he intended us to understand by that decision is another topic. Replies were then written. Shoghi Effendi was trying to read all outgoing mail, whether written on his behalf or not, and would sometimes take the opportunity to add a postscript. Equally, the secretaries, knowing that a letter on behalf of the Guardian was in the works, might write their own letter to that person, or to a Baha'i publication at the same address, and put it in the same envelope. Their letter might be dated the day before or after the Guardian's letter, or the letter written on his behalf, especially in the periods when post was received and dispatched at Haifa only once or twice per week, because of the steamer schedules. The receiver, or a later editor, might treat both letters as on behalf of the Guardian. There was no strict separation between official and personal correspondence, and the letters looked the same, since Shoghi Effendi only used his letterhead paper for some correspondence with important officials. Now, as I said, I asked the research department about various anomalies in the letters categorized as On Behalf of Shoghi Effendi in 1994. The answer is on the screen in the form of a memorandum from the research department. The heart of that response is a quote from The Guardian on December 7, 1930. He wrote, "I wish to add and say that whatever letters are sent in my behalf from Haifa are all read and approved by me before mailing. There is no exception whatever to this rule." There is a logical fallacy which goes, everyone called John is a man, so all men are called John. In this case, the writer is arguing, every letter on behalf of the Guardian was read by him, so all letters read by him are written on his behalf. Shoghi Effendi read every letter on his behalf does not equal every letter that Shoghi Effendi read or added his postscript to was written on his behalf. There are mixed letters that begin on behalf of the Guardian and then slip into a personal mode. Some editors have dealt with this by omitting the parts they judge to be personal correspondence. And there are personal letters that incidentally insert an observation from the Guardian, as in Ruhi Afnan's comments on Eric Watkins' thesis. It's complicated. All in all, the state of the art as regards letters written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi rates somewhere between a 0 and 1 on a scale of 1 to 5. There is no history of the Secretariat. The materials are collected by assorted editors with various criteria, which they often do not explain to their readers. There is no system to ensure that once a letter is determined to be not authentic, quotations from the letter are flagged for removal from future publications. There is no comprehensive collection of the correspondence to the United States, and only a partial collection for other parts of the world. No distinction is made between Shoghi Effendi's letters to individuals published with his approval and those published without his approval. Letters whose publication he did not approve are later published against his wishes, and then quoted as authoritative sources by people and institutions who should know better. And the result of all of this is confusion in the Baha'i community about what the Baha'i teachings are. Identifying the letters that are really written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi is not the only issue in the way we use material from Shoghi Effendi to understand and discuss the Baha'i teachings. A bigger issue is contextual reading, which is the approach to reading used in history, biography, literary criticism, and similar fields. It requires more than not taking one sentence out of its context, and more than finding the whole text of the letters where only a paragraph has been published. The context is always an act of communication from someone to someone who may have asked a question. Knowing the issue for the reader and the writer is very important. We want to know not only what was said, what those words meant to the writer and receiver, but also why it was important to say that. What is the thrust or burden of that communication? Good reading is usually biographical. If I do not know what has shaped the writer and what else the writer has written, and the vocabulary and the materials that the writer was reading, how can I understand what he or she is saying and why? In May 2024, I did a video called A Baha'i Theocracy, which used one letter written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi as an example of contextual reading. It looks at a 1949 letter that refers to the Baha'i Theocracy, to discover that it is actually about David Hoffman's ideas, not Shoghi Effendi's ideas. That video also has some opinions about the need to develop source criticism as a foundational approach in Baha'i studies. So many clever Baha'i authors lead their readers up the garden path just because they have not checked their sources and read them in context.